Hey guys, Josh here from Momentum Productions, and my brother from Alameda, California is joining me in this video. Today I'm going to be showing you how to produce unbelievable bokeh, also known as depth of field. Let's get to it, and what are you doing?
Come on.
You're my model, you're supposed to be professional.
Wait.
Alright, let's get to it. Alright, so in order to achieve beautiful depth of field, it's important to remember this. I am shooting on a Sony Alpha 9. This is a full frame camera. Crop sensor cameras are not as good as full frame cameras when it comes to achieving bokeh unless you're using a really fast lens like a 1.4, 1.2, 1.8. Something like an f4, like this Zeiss lens, it's not as fast as, let's say, 2.8, but it can still achieve shallow depth of field since the sensor is full frame. So if you're shooting on a crop sensor camera, I recommend shooting at a mid-range to telephoto lens. You can use a zoom lens if you like. The more you zoom in on a specific subject, the more blurry of a background you are going to get. Just remember to keep your subject far away from the background. The farther away you have the subject from the background, the more focus you are going to have on the specific subject, in this case my brother, and you are going to have a shallow background. Let's get started. Alright, so oddly enough, this camera here creates a really beautiful shallow depth of field. And we are shooting on a Canon Rebel T6S. This is a crop sensor camera. However, I am shooting on an 18-135 zoom lens. And it's a pretty slow lens. We're shooting at an aperture of 5.0. So even with a slightly higher aperture, you can still get a nice shallow depth of field. Now, since I am focused on getting the shallow depth of field with the Sony A9, let's switch over to the Sony A9. Notice my settings here. I'm shooting at an f4, which is an aperture of 4.0. This is the widest setting I can get on the iris. We are also all the way zoomed in, shooting at 70 millimeters. Now in this shot, since it's kind of like an interview style, we are not going to get the utmost bokeh. However, we are going to get a blurry background. The closer I have the subject to the camera, the more blurry the background is going to be. So don't forget, the more open your aperture, the more sensitive your sensor in your camera is to light. When it comes to shutter speed, I don't think that shutter speed can really help you out with creating a shallow depth of field, but it can help you out with producing more light. So by increasing your shutter speed, you are actually darkening up your footage. By lowering the shutter speed, you are increasing the light that is in your footage. So let's see what happens when we go back to a wider zoom range. Let's say if we go to a 50, we are going to get a less shallow depth of field. By decreasing the focal length, we are letting more subjects enter the frame, and the camera is not focused on our preferred subject as much as before. By increasing the focal length, we will get that shallower depth of field. That's why I like to use zoom lenses. Instead of switching out different primes, especially if you're a run and gun filmmaker, a zoom lens really decreases your setup time and overall shooting time. Now the downsides to using a zoom lens is that it's not as fast as a prime lens. For example, I own a 1.8 50mm Canon lens. That lens is pretty quick and it gets me the most shallow depth of field when I want it. So I love using that lens. When we're using zoom lenses, we have the tendency of getting, especially around the corners, we get some vignetting using zoom lenses. The best thing to do is to bring some external lighting equipment with you. Right, we are using softboxes and umbrellas here. I recommend using softboxes and umbrellas that don't have any flickering. So if you're shooting at a pretty high shutter speed, you might see some flickering in your footage. I'm shooting at a shutter speed of 1/60th. So these lights are not flickering at that shutter speed. That's a good thing. If you have extra setup time or extra lenses, do use prime lenses. They are going to get you more light, they are much faster, and most of the time, they get you shallower depth of field, especially if you're shooting at an 85mm lens, 50, and sometimes even a 35mm lens. All right, so now we're shooting in a bigger area here. This is what I strongly recommend that you shoot in if possible. That way you are able to use space to your advantage, especially when you're using a narrow lens. When we take a look at the Canon 50mm lens shot on the Canon T6S, we'll notice that I get a pretty shallow depth of field. I'm shooting at a 50mm lens, but I'm pretty close to the Sony A9, leaving the background pretty far away. This is how we're gonna get that nice bokeh, especially if we take a look at my brother. He's significantly blurred out. Now let's switch over to the Sony A9. My brother is now in focus and the background is blurry. However, it's not as blurry as the Canon camera. That's because this scenario is a little bit different. My brother is closer to the background than the Sony A9 is. So the closer you have your subject to the background, the less of that shallow depth of field you are going to get. Again, I'm shooting at a 70mm lens on the Sony A9 and shooting on a 50mm lens on the Canon T6S. I'm shooting at f5 on the Canon and an f4 on the Sony. The wider you have your aperture, the more sensitive and the shallower depth of field you are going to achieve. So using zoom lenses allows us to easily transform a footage by using multiple different focal lengths. For example, I'm able to shoot a shallow depth of field, or I'm able to shoot with more subjects in focus. So I'm able to zoom in on my brother and zoom out. The wider I get, the more subjects you will see, and the more subjects will be in focus. As I zoom in on my brother, he will be the star of the shot, while the rest of the objects in the background will be blurred out. Same thing with the Canon camera. The wider I go on the focal length, more things will begin to appear in focus. But the more narrow I get, the Sony A9 becomes the star of the shot, while the background is quite blurred out. Alright guys, well I hope this depth of field tutorial has taught you how to get that shallow depth of field and the effects of using different lenses and focal lengths. Don't forget that using shallow depth of field is an important and crucial element in getting cinematic footage. Don't forget to give this video a big like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so already. You can also check out my brother's YouTube channel at Jacob Morgan. Alright guys, I can't wait to see what you create, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye bye.